I was 8 the first time I realized that obedience could hurt. My father didn't need to raise his voice, not even once. He had a way of making silence louder than shouting, a way of turning a glance into a command. Our home was tidy, quiet, and unbearably still, like every breath inside it had to ask for permission first. The walls were covered in photographs where everyone was smiling, but I don't remember anyone actually smiling when those were taken. My mother would stand near the window most evenings, watching the road outside while pretending to be busy with the curtains. My father would sit in his armchair, the newspaper folded precisely in half, glasses perched low on his nose, the faint tick of his wristwatch echoing through the room. He had rules for everything: how to sit, how to speak, how to breathe in his presence. The first rule was simple: no noise. The second, no defiance. I learned early that "yes, Father" was the safest answer to almost anything. The words became automatic, rolling off my tongue before I even knew what I was agreeing to. When I did well in school, he'd nod approvingly, a rare gesture that felt like sunlight through a storm. When I made mistakes, he wouldn't shout or scold. He would pause. That pause was worse than anger. It was the heavy silence before the verdict. One evening, I spilled milk at dinner. The glass tipped over, white liquid running across the table, dripping onto the floor. My mother froze. My father's fork stopped midair. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me. And in that look was a weight that made my stomach twist. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but my throat locked. He finally stood, walked to the cabinet, and took out the small leather belt he kept neatly folded beside his ties. I remember the soft sound it made when he uncoiled it, like a whisper cutting through the room. "Stand up," he said quietly. I obeyed. I always obeyed. The punishment wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no chaos, only the rhythmic sound of the belt meeting skin, my small gasps swallowed by the stillness of the house. My mother didn't move. She just turned her face away, her hands trembling slightly on her lap. When it was over, my father handed me a towel and told me to clean the floor. "Mistakes," he said, "are only forgiven when corrected." That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the air thick with silence. I thought about how calm he'd been, how certain. He believed he was teaching me responsibility. Maybe in his mind, that was love. As I grew older, I began to understand his world wasn't built on cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was built on control. Every act of discipline was, in his eyes, an act of care. Every punishment, a lesson. But there was something dark underneath, a need for order that swallowed everything else. By the time I turned 12, the fear had become part of me. I didn't need the belt anymore. I'd punish myself in small ways before he could. If my grades dropped, I'd skip dinner. If I said something wrong, I'd kneel by my bed whispering apologies into the dark until my voice gave out. My friends at school thought I was quiet because I was shy. The truth was, I didn't know how to exist outside obedience. Then, one evening, something shifted. I had been playing outside and I came home late, 20 minutes past curfew. When I walked through the door, the house felt different. My father was waiting in the living room, the lights dimmed, his expression unreadable. "Do you know what time it is?" "Yes, Father." He looked at his watch. "Then you chose to be late." I started to explain how I'd lost track of time, how it wouldn't happen again, but my words felt useless before they even reached him. He stood, motioned toward the hallway, and said, "In my study." The study was his private world, books in perfect rows, desk polished, a faint smell of leather and dust. When I entered, he closed the door behind us. The sound of it locking clicked like a sentence being sealed. "Remove your shoes," he said. I did. My hands trembled, but I kept my face blank. He took the same belt from the drawer, the same one that had marked my childhood. "You broke a rule," he said, as though reciting scripture, "and rules are what keep this house together."
What happened next felt slower than time itself. Each sound, the snap of leather, the crack of impact, my shallow breathing stretched into eternity. I didn't cry this time. I just stared at the floor, watching the light from the desk lamp spill across the wooden boards. When he finished, he placed the belt on the table and spoke softly, almost kindly. A man who cannot control himself will be controlled by others. Remember that. I nodded. Yes, Father. But something inside me shifted that night. For the first time, I didn't feel sorry. I didn't feel obedient. I felt numb. And in that numbness, a question began to grow quietly, like a small crack in the foundation of everything I believed. What if obedience itself was the crime?
I remember the morning after that last punishment like a photograph, every detail frozen, sharp, and too quiet. The house smelled faintly of furniture polish and black coffee. My father sat at the dining table as always, reading the newspaper, the headline blurred behind the steam of his mug. My mother moved silently between the stove and the table, setting down breakfast without a word. I took my seat. The chair creaked slightly under my weight, and his eyes flicked up for just a moment. Not angry, just measuring. That was how he always looked at me now, like I was a task he hadn't yet finished. He said, "You'll learn to respect time, won't you?" "Yes, Father." He nodded, returning to his paper. That was it. The conversation was over, and so was the morning. But something had changed. The obedience that used to feel automatic now tasted bitter. Every "yes, Father" felt like swallowing metal. He hadn't noticed it yet, how still my tone had become, how my eyes no longer lowered all the way when he spoke. But I had noticed. Inside, a slow burn was growing, quiet and dangerous. At school, I started sitting alone during lunch, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to belong. My classmates talked about their fathers, how they went fishing or played cricket or laughed over movies. I didn't know what that sounded like. One afternoon, a man named Mr. Hale stopped me in the hallway. He was new, maybe in his early 30s, with kind eyes that didn't flinch when he looked at you. He said, "Daniel, I noticed your essay on the meaning of freedom. It was heavier than I expected. Everything okay at home?" The question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked me that before. I hesitated, then said, "Everything's fine, sir." He smiled gently, but his eyes said he didn't believe me. He said, "Sometimes silence tells its own story." That sentence followed me for weeks. Silence tells its own story. I began to wonder what my silence had been saying all these years, and who I was really protecting it with. That same month, my father got stricter. Maybe he sensed the shift in me, the small pauses before I answered, the way I'd stare a little too long before saying yes. He began checking my homework line by line, my tone of voice, even the way I folded my bedsheet. He called it structure. I called it a slow suffocation. Then came the night I didn't answer him. It was late, past 10. I was in my room, reading under the covers with a small flashlight. My mother was asleep. My father walked in without knocking. "Lights out means sleep," he said. I froze. The book trembled in my hands. I could feel his presence, that invisible gravity that always pulled the air out of the room. "Yes, Father," I murmured, reaching to switch it off. But then, something inside me, something small and tired, refused. I didn't move.
His voice lowered. "Did you hear me?" "I did." He stepped closer. "Then why are you still disobeying?" I looked up at him, my heartbeat thudding in my throat. "Because I'm not done." The room fell into silence. A silence so heavy it felt alive. His eyes widened, not in rage, just disbelief. I had broken the first rule. He didn't shout. He simply said, "Stand up." I stayed seated. For a long time, we just stared at each other. Father and son, two ghosts of the same fear. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the question of whether to punish or to understand. But he chose the familiar path. He reached for the belt. Before he could raise it, I said quietly, "You don't have to do this." The words weren't defiant, they were desperate. My voice cracked, but I kept going. "You think this will make me better. It won't. It just makes me smaller." He froze, belt still in his hand. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, he looked uncertain. My hands were shaking, but I didn't look away. "You always said control keeps us safe, but what if it's just keeping us scared?" For a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or recognition, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He put the belt down on the desk and left the room. That night, the silence felt different. Not oppressive, but hollow, like the air after a storm. In the morning, he didn't come for breakfast. My mother said he'd gone to work early. She looked at me, her eyes soft, almost relieved. She whispered, "You shouldn't have said that." "I know, but I had to." It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. For years, obedience had been my armor, but now I realized it had also been my cage. And once you see the bars, you can't pretend they're not there. Days passed, and my father spoke less to me. The distance between us became a quiet war. He began correcting me less. Maybe out of restraint, maybe out of exhaustion. I didn't know. But I felt it. The invisible line between fear and freedom had been drawn. I thought I was winning. But fear doesn't leave that easily. It lingers, in the way I folded my clothes perfectly, even when no one was watching, in the way my heart raced at every creak of the floorboards. The control he built outlived him. It had moved inside me. I started hearing the belt even when it wasn't there. The soft sound of leather coiling in the dark. The echo of his calm voice. A man who cannot control himself will be controlled by others. I hated that I still remembered it. I hated that it still felt true. That's when I began writing, late at night, after everyone slept. I wrote letters I never sent, to him, to myself, to the boy I used to be, words that bled instead of healed. Each line was an act of defiance, each word a whisper of freedom, but somewhere deep down I knew this story wasn't finished. Because control doesn't die quietly. It waits, patient, watchful, waiting for the moment you least expect it to return. Weeks passed after that night, quietly, as if the house itself were holding its breath. My father no longer raised his voice, no longer corrected the smallest mistake. But that calm wasn't peace. It was restraint, a wall made of unspoken things. He began coming home later, his footsteps slower, his eyes unreadable. Dinner became mechanical, plates clinking, the clock ticking, no words exchanged. My mother tried to fill the silence with questions about school, but her voice trembled each time he didn't answer. And I sat there, pretending to eat, wondering which one of us was really being punished. One evening, he finally spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone measured, almost soft, "about what you said that night." I looked up from my plate. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. That was worse, somehow. He continued, "You believe I'm too harsh. You think I rule this house with fear." My throat tightened. I didn't know if I should speak, but he waited, and his waiting was its own command. "I think," I began, carefully, "I think you mistake control for care." His gaze sharpened. "Control is care, Daniel. Without it, everything falls apart." "But I'm not a thing you have to hold together. I'm your son." The silence that followed felt like a drop into cold water. He stared at me for a long moment, as if I'd spoken in another language. Then he rose from his chair and left the table without a word. After that, he didn't speak to me for days. He didn't shout or threaten. That would have been easier. Instead, he erased me. He'd enter the room, look straight through me, and walk away. It was as though I'd vanished. And that hurt more than any punishment he'd ever given me. I tried to tell myself I didn't care, but the truth was I did, because part of me still wanted him to see me, to acknowledge that I existed beyond obedience. Then came the night the storm broke. It was late again. The rain was slamming against the windows and thunder rolled through the house. My mother had gone to bed early with a headache. I was in the living room trying to finish a school project when I heard the front door open. My father entered, soaked from the rain, his jaw clenched tight. He dropped his coat on the floor, something he'd never done before, and walked past me without a glance. But I saw his hands trembling. For a few minutes, the house was silent except for the rain. Then from the hallway, his voice came, low but sharp. "Daniel."
I turned. "Yes, Father." He stepped closer, his face pale in the dim light. "I spoke to your teacher today," he said. "Mr. Hale." My stomach dropped. "He says you've been writing disturbing essays about fear, about punishment, about me." I froze. I didn't, I started, but he cut me off. "Don't lie," he snapped. "You think you can expose this family's private matters to strangers? You think that makes you brave?" He took another step forward, and I saw it. That familiar look, the same one from all those years, the look that came right before the belt. But this time, something inside me didn't flinch. "I didn't write it to hurt you," I said quietly. "I wrote it because it's true." His voice dropped, dangerous. "True?" "Yes," I whispered. "You taught me to fear you, not to understand you." His nostrils flared. "I gave you discipline. You gave me silence, and I learned to mistake it for love." His breath hitched just slightly before the anger took over again. "Enough," he said, turning away. But I didn't stop. "Do you even know why you do it? Why everything has to be perfect? Why every mistake feels like betrayal?" He froze. I hadn't meant to say it, but the words kept coming. "You weren't just teaching me obedience, were you? You were fighting something inside yourself." His shoulders stiffened. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. Real fear, not mine, but his. Then, in a voice so small it barely reached me, he said, "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then tell me. Tell me what I don't know." He stared at me for a long, unbearable moment. Then, to my shock, he sat down. I was 15, he said slowly, his eyes fixed somewhere far away. My father came home drunk. He stopped, his throat tightening. I waited, my heart pounding. He beat my brother until he couldn't walk, said it was for his own good. The next day, my brother ran away, never came back. His voice trembled for the first time in my life. I swore I'd never let my home become like his, that my children would grow strong, that they'd never be weak. I felt tears sting my eyes. And in trying to protect me from that pain, you gave me your version of it. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for once I saw the man beneath the father. Not the authority, not the shadow, just a frightened boy who never healed. The rain outside softened. The silence between us didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt fragile. He stood up slowly and walked to the cabinet. From the drawer, he pulled out the old belt, the same one I had feared my whole childhood. He set it on the table between us. I kept it because I thought it made me strong. Then, without another word, he walked to the fireplace, opened the grate, and threw it in. The leather hissed as the flames caught. We both watched it burn, years of control curling into smoke. He didn't apologize. I didn't ask him to. Some things don't need words, they just need to end. When he turned back, his face looked older. I don't know how to be any other way, he said. Then start by not being him, I whispered. He nodded, and for the first time in my life, my father smiled. Not the proud smile he gave at report cards, but a small, trembling one, the kind that said, maybe we can try. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't hear the sound of the belt. Only the rain, only peace.
Years passed before I truly understood what happened that night. By the time I left home, the walls that once echoed with command had grown quieter. My father aged quickly, not in his body, but in his eyes. There was a softness there that hadn't existed before, though sometimes I wondered if it was really softness or just regret that had settled too deep to name. When I went away to college, he never said goodbye. He stood by the car, one hand gripping the edge of the door, the other buried in his pocket. A man who wanted to speak but had forgotten how. And as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him through the mirror, shoulders hunched, face half-turned, swallowed by the distance between us. For years, I told myself I didn't miss him, but every time I closed my eyes, I still heard the sound of that belt, not as pain anymore, but as memory. It was strange how silence could become an echo. I studied psychology maybe to make sense of people like him, or maybe to make sense of myself. Each lecture about control, trauma, or generational patterns felt like someone reading pages of my own life aloud. And yet, no matter how much theory I learned, nothing prepared me for the day I got the call. It was early morning. My mother's voice on the phone was small, like a whisper carried through time. "Your father's been in the hospital," she said. "Heart complications. You should come." I hesitated. Years of distance had built a wall so tall I didn't know how to climb it. But something in her tone, fragile, pleading, made me pack my bag. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and old apologies. He looked smaller than I remembered, fragile, almost transparent beneath the thin white sheet. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. He wasn't the man who'd filled doorways with authority, whose shadow had defined my childhood. He was just a man lying still, the lines on his face deep enough to tell the story of what control does to the soul. When his eyes opened, they found mine slowly, uncertainly. He said, "Daniel." His voice was raspy but clear. "You came. I wanted to say I shouldn't have, that he didn't earn it. But all I said was, yes, I came. He smiled faintly and something in his face broke open, a quiet vulnerability that I had waited years to see. He whispered, I don't expect forgiveness, but I thought of you every day. My throat tightened. I know, I said, even when you couldn't say it. He reached for my hand, trembling. He said, you were right, you know. Fear doesn't make strength, it only makes silence. His grip was weak, but in it was something truer than all his lessons, an admission that the man who once demanded obedience had finally learned humility. We sat there for a long time, saying very little. Outside, the light through the blind shifted, and for a brief moment, the warmth touched his face like forgiveness itself. When I left that night, he was asleep. Or at least I told myself he was. He passed 2 days later. At his funeral, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much. People spoke about him as a good man, a disciplined man, a man who raised his son well. And I stood there thinking, yes, he did raise me, but not the way they thought. He raised me through fear, through silence, through the shadow of his own brokenness. And still, somehow, that made me who I am.
After the ceremony, I went back to the old house. It hadn't changed much. The same creaking stairs, the same smell of wood and thyme. But it felt emptier, softer. I walked into the living room where the fireplace had long gone cold. In the corner of the mantel, there was a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside it, folded neatly, was the old belt buckle, melted and twisted, a relic from the fire years ago. Beside it, a note in my father's uneven handwriting. For what I took from you, I tried to give back in silence, but I see now, silence is not healing. I hope you found the voice I never had.
I stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. He hadn't been a monster. He hadn't been a hero either. He was just a man, flawed, frightened, and human. And maybe that was the lesson after all. That night, as I sat in the empty house, I realized something. The sound of the belt had never really been about punishment. It was about control, the illusion that fear could shape love, that pain could protect. But in the end, it only created more silence. I thought of every child who'd been taught obedience instead of understanding, every parent who mistook discipline for devotion. We inherit more than names from our families. We inherit their unfinished wars. And it's up to us whether we keep fighting them or finally lay them to rest. I took the note, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the box. Then I lit the fireplace one last time. The flames flickered across the walls, the same walls that once echoed with anger, and for the first time, they felt warm, not harsh. As the firelight danced, I whispered, maybe to him, maybe to myself, I forgive you. The words didn't erase the past. They didn't heal every scar. But they loosened something that had been tight in my chest for years. When the fire dimmed, I looked around the room that had witnessed both fear and love, punishment and peace. And I realized
This was how control ends. Not with defiance, not with pain, but with understanding. Because the sound of the belt might fade, but the silence after it, the one filled with honesty, that's the sound of freedom.